In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe witnessed dramatic changes, some peaceful, others violent. Among the most crucial transformations were the shifting alliances and growing fears of Russian aggression. This video explores NATO's expansion, the wars that shaped Eastern Europe, and how Russia's actions in Ukraine have drastically reshaped the continent's security landscape. These historical shifts have had far-reaching consequences, not just for Europe, but for global geopolitics. NATO's growing power and Russia's resentment. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 left a power vacuum in Eastern Europe. For nations like Poland, Czechia, and Hungary, the path to security lay in NATO, but their decision to join the alliance wasn't just about defense. It was a strategic move to anchor themselves in the West. However, Russia viewed this expansion as a direct threat. In this video, we explore how the expansion of NATO in the 1990s ignited a chain of events that would lead to the devastating conflicts we see today, with Europe caught in the crossfire of a resurgent Russia. Is NATO's growing power the key to Europe's peace, or is it the spark that will ignite a much larger war? What if the biggest threat to European peace wasn't Russia's power, but the fear NATO's expansion created? Let's dive into the origins of today's geopolitical tensions, the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of NATO. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 left many countries in Eastern Europe suddenly independent but vulnerable. With the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, nations like Poland, Czechia, and Hungary found themselves without the military protection they had relied on under Soviet rule. Faced with a resurgent Russia, they sought NATO membership for security. These countries had long histories of Russian occupation and feared future invasions. Their membership in NATO wasn't just a diplomatic shift, it was a critical move to ensure their sovereignty and to protect their newly found freedom. The First Chechen War, 1994 to 1996. In the 1990s, Russia struggled to maintain control over its territories, and Chechnya became a flashpoint. The Russian invasion in 1994, intended to swiftly crush Chechen separatists, instead turned into a brutal, drawn-out conflict. Cities like Grozny were devastated by Russian artillery and airstrikes, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed. The Russian government's attempt to reintegrate Chechnya into Russia became a stark example of the use of heavy artillery against civilians, setting a precedent for future Russian military operations. This war marked the beginning of a new, more aggressive Russian military strategy that would continue for years. Russia's brutal tactics would become a blueprint for future conflicts, like in Syria and Ukraine. Poland's push for NATO membership. By the late 1990s, Poland and its neighbors saw the increasing instability in Russia and knew that without NATO protection, they were vulnerable. Poland's government, in particular, lobbied aggressively for NATO membership, even threatening to develop nuclear weapons if not accepted. The fear of being reoccupied by Russia was palpable, especially given the country's history of invasions. Poland's position in Central Europe, historically at the crossroads of Russian and Western power struggles, made its inclusion in NATO vital. By 1997, Poland, Czechia, and Hungary had received invitations to join NATO, and by 1999, they were officially part of the alliance. This marked a historic moment in European security and demonstrated the transformative power. Russia's resurgence and the Second Chechen War, 1999 to 2000, Vladimir Putin's rise to power in 1999 marked a turning point in Russia's political trajectory and military strategy. Following years of instability and perceived weakness in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, Putin's leadership signaled a return to assertive and centralized governance. Shortly after becoming prime minister, Putin initiated the Second Chechen War, a campaign designed to suppress the separatist movement in Chechnya, which had become a symbol of Russia's diminished authority in its own territory. Unlike the First Chechen War, 1994 to 1996, which ended in a humiliating stalemate for Russia, the Second Chechen War was prosecuted with ruthless efficiency. The conflict began with a massive aerial bombardment of Chechnya, including the destruction of its capital, Grozny, which was reduced to rubble. Russian forces employed overwhelming firepower and relentless ground assaults, systematically dismantling Chechen resistance. Civilian casualties were significant, and accusations of widespread human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings and the targeting of non-combatants, tarnished Russia's international reputation. Domestically, however, the war achieved its political objectives. The brutal suppression of Chechnya not only reasserted Russian control over the region but also solidified Putin's popularity. By projecting an image of strength and decisiveness, he gained widespread support among a populace weary of the chaos and perceived humiliation of the 1990s. This consolidation of power enabled Putin to implement sweeping reforms, centralizing authority within the Kremlin and marginalizing political opposition. The war also marked the beginning of Putin's broader strategy of leveraging military power to restore Russia's influence on the global stage. The Second Chechen War had far-reaching implications beyond the borders of the Caucasus. It reinforced a policy of using force to maintain territorial integrity and suppress dissent, which would become a hallmark of Russia's approach in subsequent conflicts, including in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. It also underscored Putin's willingness to challenge Western norms and assert Russia's independence from international criticism. This conflict laid the groundwork for Russia's resurgence as a formidable geopolitical actor in the 21st century. NATO's expansion continues. As Russia pursued aggressive actions in Chechnya and began to reassert itself on the world stage, the former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern and Central Europe sought security and closer ties with the West. The prospect of NATO membership became increasingly appealing, particularly for nations that had endured decades of Soviet domination. The alliance, founded on principles of collective defense, offered a means of safeguarding their sovereignty against the possibility of renewed Russian aggression. By 2004, NATO had extended invitations to 7 additional countries: Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. For these nations, joining NATO was not merely a symbolic step, it was a strategic necessity. The memory of Soviet occupation was fresh in the minds of their populations, and the fear of a resurgent Russia was palpable. The Baltic states, in particular, faced unique vulnerabilities due to their geographic proximity to Russia and the presence of significant ethnic Russian minorities within their borders. These minorities, concentrated in cities like Riga and Narva, were seen by some as potential flashpoints for unrest or as a pretext for Russian intervention, scenarios that had already played out in parts of Ukraine and Moldova. NATO's expansion in the early 2000s was not without controversy. Russia viewed the alliance's enlargement as a direct threat to its sphere of influence and a betrayal of informal assurances reportedly made at the end of the Cold War. Russian leaders argued that NATO's presence along its borders disrupted the balance of power in Europe and escalated tensions. Nevertheless, for the new member states, NATO's guarantees of collective defense under Article 5 of its charter were seen as indispensable. This expansion fundamentally reshaped the security landscape of Europe, creating a buffer against Russian imperial ambitions and reaffirming the West's commitment to supporting democracies in the region. The eastward expansion of NATO, while primarily defensive in nature, also served as a deterrent to potential Russian adventurism. It underscored the alliance's resolve to uphold the sovereignty of its members and sent a clear message that aggression against one would be met with a unified response. For Russia, however, this expansion reinforced a narrative of encirclement, fueling resentment and contributing to its increasingly confrontational posture in international relations. This dynamic, rooted in mutual distrust, would define the strained relationship between Russia and the West in the years to come. Russia's actions in the 21st century. Throughout the 2000s, Russia under Putin continued to assert its military power. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, seizing 2 breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This invasion was a clear message to Georgia and its neighbors that Russia would not tolerate NATO influence in its former sphere of control. Then, in 2015, Russia intervened in Syria to support President Bashar al-Assad, further demonstrating its willingness to use military force to maintain its influence in the region. These actions were a clear signal to NATO that Russia would not tolerate any encroachment on its sphere of influence. The international community, particularly the United States and Europe, struggled to respond, as many were preoccupied with their own financial and political crises.